समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया.
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
अब समझा.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to a fresh new episode of Geopolitics with Swasti, where Swasti Rao, our consulting editor for strategic and international affairs, takes your questions, dear subscribers, on geopolitical developments around the world. Now, Swasti, there has been a gap and we are back after a long time, so welcome back. And a lot has happened geopolitically. The biggest news right now is the blast that happened in Red Fort, and a lot of our subscribers have a few questions related to that. So I'll begin with that. And the first question for today is by Deepak Tanwar, who wants to ask you that do you see foreign hands behind the blast, and will that mean this is the start of Op Sindoor Part 2? And adding to that, since it's on a similar vein, there's a question by Dheeraj Reddy who asks that should we then be focusing more on improving our intelligence gathering capabilities?
So as far as the second part is concerned, of course, I mean, we need to improve our intelligence gathering capabilities. And frankly, when something wrong happens, something bad happens, it's very easy to find faults with intelligence agencies. But come to think of it, I mean, for everything that happens, there are 10 others that are averted that never really come to notice. So you have to keep that in mind. And even for this particular incident, we all now know that a much sinister relay was actually planned, and that couldn't happen. And basically what happened was just a little fragment of what really was planned. I mean, this is what we know. And the second thing is that it's just been a week, so the situation is fast evolving, and at such times it is extremely important to wait for more confirmations and more official narratives to come out, because a lot of then misinformation sort of, and the fog of misinformation starts to percolate down to social media discussions, and often that comes as a barrier to us understanding the real situation and the bigger picture. So one thing is that let's exercise restraint. The second thing is that even at the print, I think wonderful work has and wonderful research has been published on this particular issue. So I urge you to go and read all of that as much as possible. You can watch Cut the Clutter, you can read National Interest. I mean, a lot of things actually I can go on saying. But as far as I think Deepak's point is concerned about, is there a foreign hand? Now, very quickly, there are two ways in which you look at it. One is that when you're talking about how to tackle terrorism, you're looking at how to mainstream, let's say, marginalized sections of your population, and by sort of eradicating poverty in those sections. And because the more, let's say, poverty stricken you are, the more outside the mainstream you are, the more vulnerable you become to radicalization, right? So that's a classic radicalization theory. In this particular case, what we see is that at least the couple of doctors that have been named again and again, they were educated, they were very much doing respectable jobs, and they were internationals as well. So in such a situation, it becomes very difficult, because it is completely against the classical, let's say, de-radicalization theory, because this is white collar terrorism. So obviously there's something which is deeper at play. And in terms of foreign hand being involved, I think the only thing we right now know is that the Jaish-e-Mohammed, there have been links established to the Jaish-e-Mohammed. I don't think the official sources have really named any country so far. So we should wait for that, okay? We should not jump the gun and say that, that the very next day something happened in Pakistan and they completely jumped the gun and without any basis named India. So I think we need to sort of hold our own ground and wait for any official confirmations. I think as far as the other part of your question goes, if there is enough credible evidence, or if the government sees it important to then retaliate in the manner in which they deem fit, I think we will see that. We will see the government doing it. The Operation Sindoor is ongoing. That it is still paused. It is only paused. So, if need be, I think we will see more things happening. But right now, I personally think that, and my opinion is that, we need to up our intelligence. Yes, I mean, no matter what others say, intelligence again is a work in progress because it sort of evolves in proportion to how the threats evolve. It is true that this particular attack, especially in Delhi, right? Let's say this particular blast in Delhi has happened after almost a decade. So this is serious, but without jumping the gun, let's sort of let's understand that we cannot let our guard down. Perhaps that's the only key takeaway. And if need be, we'll come to know. And I'm of the opinion that if there is need, the government will go for uh, any measure that it deems fit.
Moving on from there, Swasti, there is a question by our subscriber Rohit who asks that we recently saw Al Shara at the White House, and how do you then see the embrace of him by the Trump administration, and what
Hmm.
implications will it have on the politics of the region?
You know, Devdatta, lately I've because I cover the the war in Ukraine and I sort of write about it. But one of the things that had lately gotten me very interested and invested actually is the sort of how this war is sort of spilling over in other theaters. And there are two theaters where the dynamics are intrinsic to what is happening in the Russia-Ukraine front, and those two theaters are Middle East and Africa. And that is why I think last few months I have been working and also traveling across the Middle Eastern theater. So Syria is a fascinating case study. Syria right now, and okay, this embrace of Al Shara by Donald Trump, that's one part, of course. Now we know that there is also some intelligence reports that have been uncovered that Al Shara was instrumental in also sort of um, aiding the US administration even before when Assad was there. And, in many ways he was fighting Assad. And you know that Assad was backed by Iran and Russia. But coming to the present times, there's something very interesting. What you have in Syria right now is not a full sovereign country. Syria right now exists in different power centers. So, what you have in Damascus is where you have Al Shara. That is the legitimate government and the visible government of Syria. Uh, but northern Syria is where you have the Kurds. And Turkey wants to have its influence there because it wants to control the Kurds. United States supports these Kurds in order to maintain its leverage over Turkey. Okay, because you know that Turkey is a bit of an outlier when it comes to NATO. Even though under Trump, you see that Erdogan and Donald Trump's relations are quite cozy. But having said that, the traditional policy in the United States administration has been to use the Kurds to sort of maintain their leverage over Turkey. So that is northern Syria. If you look at southern Syria, you have the Israeli, so to say, influence because that is where the Druze live. That is where they have a border with Israel. And if you remember that Israel has already taken the Golan Heights. Okay, so and Israel has maintained that they will not allow the Syrian army to concentrate any kind of deployments near its own borders. And all this that you see that just because Al Shara is now closer to Trump, and you see perhaps there were certain reports that claimed that Al Shara is going to ask Trump to ask the Israelis to withdraw. None of that is going to happen. Syria is going to continue in this fragmented form. Actually, it's less of fragmentation, and if you ask me, it's more of a balance of power. So there are different power brokers that are controlling Syria, and as long as you have somebody that maintains that equilibrium continues, it's all right. This is going to sort of see a new light, and actually quite. Literally, because for the first time, electricity returned for more than 18 hours, 20 hours in Syrian cities. So Syria is on its way to modernize, but with this particular power arrangement that in the north there is Turkish influence, and then you have the US presence there. There is a particular corridor where the US troops are present, and they are making sure that that power equilibrium is not disturbed. In the south it's Israel. And in fact, there were a couple of I think weeks ago, there were also reports that United States perhaps could be looking at having a full-fledged base. I'm not sure if the full-fledged base is really required because you have the US troops on the ground to maintain that equilibrium. So we will see that happening, but Syria getting more sort of co-opted with the Western bloc. I mean, whether it's Israel or whether it's Turkey or whether it's US, there are internal disturbances. I mean, there are internal disagreements, but they are definitely unified when it comes to Russia and Iran. So this is a complete, let's say, breakdown in the influence of both Moscow and Tehran in the region. But this cozying up between US and Al Shara has its own limitations. But indeed, it's a win. There is no doubt about the fact. Yes.
Moving on, Swasti, there's a question by Tanusu on Sudan, and she has a very important question on there are so many atrocities happening in Sudan, but why is that part of the world so ignored? Who is funding these killings, and which countries have the influence to stop it?
As always, I say Tanusu has asked me the best question. So, Tanusu, I must commend you for that. And also that you are a girl. So, it sort of makes me feel very proud always taking your question and answering them, because geopolitics and strategic discussions are often conflated as male dominated bastions. And we are all trying to sort of make it more gender equal. So, coming back to Sudan and the civil wars there, the tragedy with Africa is that Africa and the African wars and the civil wars have become a forgotten theater, frankly. Nobody really cares about, there is an Africa fatigue. So it's become very, I would say, legit to refer to, let's say, what is happening in other parts of Europe or in Indian subcontinent or even Latin America. So there is a tendency to refer to wars happening in Europe or wars happening in Caucasus or Latin America, or the Indian subcontinent. They take more primacy. But when it comes to Africa, there is an Africa fatigue because the wars have been going on as far as you can remember. Now, coming to your question on Sudan, so Sudan has been under the civil war for years. I mean, 3-4 decades. What is happening right now is important, because right now in 2020, what the civil war or the phase of civil war you see in Sudan right now actually started in 2023, because in 2023 the factions within the junta, there was a break there and they started to contest for power. So very quickly in 2019 there was this dictator there by the name of Omar al-Bashir, and Omar al-Bashir's regime, which was in place for 30 years or something, and a lot of mass killings and all, I don't have the time to go there, but this particular regime was overthrown by the junta in 2019. And this particular, let's say, junta is, so there is a Sudanese army and then there are the RSF. And RSF is, if you remember, there was a question also earlier, I had taken that question where I went into the details of what happened and who are the stakeholders, etc. But Dagalo, basically who heads the RSF, so they were together. And in 2023, there was a contest between them. And then ever since now, the two factions like the Sudanese army and the RSF, now they are fighting each other. So currently what you see is a fallout of this particular war, which is a continuation of decades of killings. Now, very quickly, what you have to understand, and which is something that I find very interesting about your question, is how does it impact the regional balance and which side is siding whom. And that is where the interesting bit comes, because when it comes to the Sudanese army, right, how many countries are supporting the Sudanese army? Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Algeria, Qatar, all of these sides are supporting the Sudanese army, giving them weapons, etc., etc. The RSF, on the other hand, is supported primarily by UAE. The question is why? And therein it gets interesting, because that is how the theaters are interlinked. And when you are doing geopolitics, it is very important to understand how these theaters are linked. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So, the RSF has been sending tens of thousands of troops to fight the Houthis in Yemen on the behalf of the Emiratis. And that is the reason that the Emiratis have been given all the support and weapons to RSF. And it's controversial because basically with these weapons, they are perpetrating mass violence, and that is what we see. But it's interesting to see how the regional sort of politics and geopolitics reflects in these long protracted wars. And we are still waiting. Actually, there is no solution. The United Nations is quite weakened. It's also cash stripped. It has also lost its legitimacy. So in such a situation, to really find a lasting solution is not so easy. So expect more killings before a real lasting solution can come. Little ceasefires and agreements they have come and gone. I mean, dozens have come and gone, but none have stayed. So it is a challenge, it is a humanitarian disaster, and it is a genocide. But it's just that we have learned to live with it. So they have been opening themselves to the gentle indifference of this world.
Coming back to the Indian Army, Swasti, Shayan Banerjee has a question on what are the reforms that we need to encourage our private sector to build a military industrial complex like the one in US.
It's quite luring to keep comparing ourselves with the United States. I think it'll be better. It's the world most advanced military. So I know. I mean, that's why I said that that's a very luring sort of a question. But I think it makes more sense to just compare ourselves with more comparable countries and see what is it that we can do better. Now, quickly, when it comes to the private sector or reforming the military industrial landscape, a couple of things. The first thing is that India's military industrial complex for decades has been driven by the DPSUs, the Defense Public Sector Units. The Defense Public Sector Units like the HAL or, DRDO and all these, establishments. Now, we know that they are marred by bureaucratic red tapeism, they are marred by timeline delays, they are marred by inefficiencies. I mean, there are many. I mean, I can just go on giving you names: BEL, BHEL, there's so many of them. Now, this is not to say that and that is the reason why, if you look at the recent defense acquisition procedure reforms, particularly 2016 and then 2020, and the latest edition that has come in 2025, you see that the government has been trying to push for more inclusion of the private sector, because when you bring in the private sector, you're actually making it more efficient. And that is how anywhere in the advanced countries of the world, it is the private sector that has driven that innovation and growth and efficiency. Okay. Anywhere you asked me the example of United States, whether it's United States, whether it's the big European defense giants, they're all private sector companies, basically. Now, quickly, in India, why it doesn't work is because they we suffer from a major national epidemic of underinvesting in our R&D. See, R&D is a sector where we have not invested. Traditionally, I mean, the numbers can vary, but traditionally, India's R&D spending has been about 0.7% of our GDP. Okay, compare that to China. And what is our GDP? It has been now 4 trillion. So if you sort of take a whatever 5-year view, it's a, let's say, between 3 to 4 trillion is our GDP, and our R&D is not even about 0.7%. Okay, that's how the average is. Compare that to a country like China with a GDP of 19 trillion almost. They are spending more than 2.6% of their GDP on R&D. So the sheer gap is so exponential that there is little we can do unless we start really investing in R&D. That is the reason why the best of a country leave the country. Why, you have people like Dr. Sanjay Baru writing a book called Secession of the Successful. When the best of your country is not being able to get absorbed in the ecosystem of your country, it just reflects. I mean, what you see reflecting in the defense industrial complex is just one example of that. Now, second, how can we improve it? Now, India and the Indian public sectors have to take the risk of failing, because by definition the military industrial technologies are so expensive that the private sector doesn't want to spend that much money in investing, which is to the tune of millions and billions. Okay, because they are not sure if they will get an order. Okay, so if you are spending whatever, let's say 100 rupees, and if you're getting an order for just 10 rupees, then it doesn't economically make
Makes
sense for
sense.
you to keep investing. So the first step is that you have to first have the appetite to fail. And that is why there, of course, you see investments. There are big defense industrial conglomerates that have come up. But again, they are the Tatas, they are the Adanis, they are, like Tassel and Adanis and Kalyani Group, etc., that have the capacity to take that failings. Okay, that's important. So they have to develop that appetite. On the other hand, the Indian establishment, the defense establishment, also have to basically encourage these private sector companies by making sure that the orders are given. Now, so many times we have discussed this case where the Crestal, which is an infantry vehicle, the Crestal infantry vehicle, which is co-developed by the Tatas, uh, it has orders from Moroccan army. The Tatas have set up a plant there. Rajnath ji was there recently to actually inaugurate that plant, but it still doesn't have orders from the Indian army. So there is something which is missing now. Of course, the armed forces have their own limitations. They have their own issues. They say that we are not able to scale. A lot of times, these equipment, they perform much better during trials, but when it comes to mass production and scaling it, that then there is a quality issue. So there are issues, but the point is that we cannot really get our act together unless we are able to close these loops. So these loops need to be closed, and no country in the world has been able to see successes without making their systems efficient, without having accountability, and without making it time bound. So there are a number of reforms that can be done, but Devdatta, there are more issues. For example, let's look at the manner in which the budget is given for our capital procurements. Okay, now the budget is given to us on a yearly basis. Okay, and if a particular branch of the armed forces is not able to utilize that money in that given year, it actually comes back to the Ministry of Finance. Right. So typically, what happens is that the bureaucratic hurdles are such, and the file movement is so slow in us. And this is after flagging it again and again, and government taking so many measures to actually reduce it. Even then, the file movement and the bureaucratic red tapeism is so intense and complex and so convoluted in our system that these armed forces are not able to even utilize the money which is allocated for defense, for their capital procurement. And then that money comes back, whatever they're not able to use comes back. And then for the next session, in the parliament, you have the finance minister standing and saying that, okay, we give you a raise of 8 to 10%. That 8 to 10% is the money that was not used from the previous year. These are things that we need to change. So how can you change that? I can give you an example because you asked for one, for the US, where you are not giving money on the basis of years. You are giving money which on for projects. So every year, you have to, or in a time bound fashion, you have to give the progress report, and the money doesn't lapse until the project is completed. So there are several changes that can be made if there is willingness, but let's face the fact that without accountability, without proper investment in R&D, without making the system efficient, and without the risk taking ability, no matter how much you set up an defense innovation fund or this fund or that fund, ultimately it is going to be a part of the ecosystem which is not efficient. So we have to take a 360-degree approach in tackling this issue. Only then can we do it.
Swasti, moving on, we have a question by A Snow who asks that what is your opinion on Vikasit Bharat by 2047? Is it really possible by then? Or do you think that in a grace period of 10 years our country will be developed?
Now, what we need is a carefully crafted macroeconomic policy to get to 2047. And I'll first tell you what exactly are we aiming to get and what are the things that we need to avoid. So, by the accepted definitions, like if you were to go to the World Bank or IMF, and there's a definition given for developed countries. So, by that, a developed country needs something like a $15,000 to $17,000 of per capita income, right? And our per capita income right now is about $2,500. And I know I'm not even getting into the nitty gritties of how, if you take out the top 1%, it's even lesser. But what I mean to say is that even if you're looking at the numbers, one of the things that we would need to do is that we would need to grow at least 8 to 10% every year. In order to achieve the growth that we require for our per capita income to go to that level. And and for that to happen, for India to grow at 8 to 10% of GDP, in order to reach that per capita levels, in order to qualify as a developed country, first of all, we will need to get our manufacturing game in shape. Because just as the size of our GDP has grown, it has not sort of translated into India becoming a manufacturing hub. Remember, India could not really capitalize or take benefit from China plus one diversification, because the investments that were not going to China didn't land in India as much. They landed in countries like Vietnam and Singapore, etc. Why they did not land in India was again because of bureaucratic hurdles, and we have talked about that at length. But what it landed up doing is that India's manufacturing in proportion to its GDP has kind of stagnated around 13, 14, 15%. Okay. Now you might see some progress in one quarter. or one sector. But if you take a long term view, you see that India is not able to sort of emerge as a manufacturing hub. So what happens is that the more we, let's say, export to the West, the more we'll end up importing from China. And all these markers, it will not help if we were to sort of, fine tune into assessing the performance of rupee, or fine tune into assessing one investment coming from Apple, or fine tune into, something here and something there. For India to emerge as a Vikas Bharat in 2047, you have to have a sound macroeconomic policy, right? And that you cannot do without getting more manufacturing done in India, without reducing the bureaucratic hurdles, without getting more investments into India. At least as far as the financial year was concerned, in the previous financial year, we are still waiting for the next one, but in the previous financial year, India earned more from remittances than it earned from investment. So we have to rectify these things. That is up as far as the economic side of things are concerned. And then, of course, we have to keep the inflation in check, we have to keep unemployment in check, etc., which is clear. The second thing is about critical dependencies. India has to reduce its critical dependencies in rare earths. India has to reduce its critical dependencies, in semiconductors. India has to reduce its critical dependencies on APIs. Those are the things which are, very, very prone to supply chain disruptions. So India has to make sure that happens. And now comes the difficult part. In order for us to really continue with our economic success story, we have to make sure we have no security lapses, and we have to make sure there are no wars. And that is why something like a live, let's say, a war, or a gray zone, those are kind of things that we need to be very, very careful of, because we obviously cannot afford our attention to be diverted to these wars, because that is going to come in the way of our 2047 modernization plans. So you need a relatively stable neighborhood and a relatively stable global outlook in order to grow in the manner in which we have to. For example, let's take the example of Trump's tariffs. All of these growing at 8 to 10% is calculated keeping in mind, or assuming, that our biggest economic relationships are working fine. America today is our biggest economic partner, biggest trading partner, with more than $200 billion worth of trade and remittances and all of that. So if we need to get the trade deal, because end of the day, the country has to grow economically. And when you talk about any macroeconomic policy, it sort of assumes certain factors in place before it can really start to show any difference. So we need to get all of that in place. It is a monumental task. And let me not forget, because we have a volatile security situation around us, it is also important that India starts to spend more on capital procurement. I mean, our total defense budget is not 2% of our GDP for a very long time, and there have been calls to increase it, to over 2% of our GDP. But now, given all the delays in procurement and all the other volatile security situations, it is said that we have to spend at least 3 to 4% of our GDP on defense, and we have to focus particularly on capital procurement, because we may be having a big defense budget, but most of it could go to pensions and salaries, right? What is the portion of which is attributed for capital procurement? So how do you cut that cycle of procurement, which any big platform takes about 10 years, 15 years? Remember, I talked about that. So even if it's not about signing a deal, it's about realizing that these are not off the shelf. What you call off the shelf is not available today. If you sign an order, you get it 15 years later. So everything is linked, to that idea of a 2047 Viksit Bharat. So I think there are a lot of things I have listed, but like I said, that end of the day, it should all boil down to a more stable macroeconomic policy.
With that, Swasti, we come to an end of this episode, and I know that we have not been able to take a lot of questions since we did this after a break. Do stay tuned for the next episodes, and we will ensure that all your questions are taken. Thank you.